I had been told to stay away from Blackwater Swamp. The locals said it in different ways, some more direct than others, but the message was clear. The swamp was no place for anyone looking to come back in one piece. But I didn't listen. I never did. As a biologist, I've always been driven by the need to understand. I spent my days in forests, wetlands, and remote habitats, documenting ecosystems few had ever seen. I wasn't scared of the wild, not like most people were. The things that scared them, snakes, bears, the deep water, I'd seen it all before. And with every new ecosystem I encountered, I felt closer to the one thing that had always fascinated me: how life adapted to survive in the most hostile places. I had been studying the swamp for months when the chance to go deeper came. An old colleague of mine, a herpetologist named Kyle, had spent years working in the area, cataloging the various species that called Blackwater home. He'd sent me an email one morning, a short message with just one line that caught my attention. "There's something out here you need to see." No elaboration, no context, just that. I responded immediately, asking for details, but the response never came. I tried calling him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I was about to write it off as a joke, but then I remembered an old conversation we had over drinks at a conference about some of the bizarre, unexplainable things he'd encountered while out in the field. He had always dismissed them, but his eyes would cloud over when he mentioned the odd things that didn't make sense. Footprints that didn't belong to any known animal. Sounds that couldn't have come from anything on Earth. The things he'd heard in the swamp, he said, were unnatural. Couldn't resist. I grabbed my gear and drove down to Florida, where Blackwater Swamp lay sprawling in all its swampy, rotting glory. Kyle had sent me a location. A small, relatively untouched stretch of the swamp, accessible only by canoe. That's how deep I had to go to find what he'd found. I had to admit, part of me was excited, but the other part felt a cold knot settle in my stomach. The day I arrived, the swamp was eerily quiet, a blanket of humid heat hanging in the air, thick enough to choke you if you weren't used to it. The trees grew so densely that the sun barely touched the water, leaving everything in a dim, greenish glow. The air was heavy with the smell of rotting vegetation and stagnant water. A far cry from the pristine wetlands I was used to studying, but that was part of the draw. I launched my canoe from a small boat ramp that was barely visible through the overgrowth. The water was still, the surface broken only by the occasional ripple of a fish or the splash of a bird diving for a meal. I paddled slowly, trying to take in the surroundings, but something in the air made my skin crawl. I couldn't put my finger on it. It was as though I was being watched. There's a certain feeling you get when you're deep in the wild, far from civilization, and you realize that you're not alone. This wasn't that. This was different. It was as if something invisible was brushing against the edges of my mind, keeping me on edge, but I shrugged it off. A few hours into the paddle, I found myself at a small clearing in the water where the trees opened up into a more expansive area of the swamp. The banks here were covered in thick, wet moss, and the ground was soft beneath the weight of my canoe. I saw the first sign of Kyle's work, his gear strewn about in a hurry, abandoned in a way that didn't sit right with me. His backpack was overturned, its contents spilling out, but there was no sign of him, no footprints in the soft mud. The first thought that crossed my mind was that he had been taken by something, but I couldn't explain why or by what. I docked my canoe and walked carefully toward the area where his gear was. As I did, I felt something pull at the edges of my senses. A tension in the air, as if something was about to break. I didn't like it, but I kept moving because that's what I do. I always move forward. I knelt down next to his gear and began to sift through the things he'd left behind. The first thing I found was a strange notebook, half soaked from being out in the elements. The pages were waterlogged and difficult to read, but I could make out parts of it. His handwriting was shaky, hurried. The further I flipped through the pages, the more frantic the notes became. Footprints near the water, too large for anything here. No known animal would leave tracks like this. I hear it again, the sound. It's not like anything I've heard before. The air vibrates when it moves. is getting closer. Something is wrong with this place. It's wrong. I can feel it in the air, in the water. I think it's watching me. The last entry was a hurried scrawl, half smeared by water. It's here. God, it's here. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I looked at the last page. Something about the way he had written that sent my mind spinning. I stood up abruptly, my eyes darting around the clearing, scanning the trees and the murky water. A sound pierced the quiet, low, almost imperceptible, like a distant rumble of thunder, but far too close to be thunder, came from the water. I froze, holding my breath. The sound came again, followed by a strange, wet sloshing noise. Something heavy moving through the water, something much larger than a fish. I turned to my canoe, my heart pounding. I felt like I should leave, but curiosity pulled me toward the water's edge. The sloshing sound continued, slow, almost methodical. I stepped closer, trying to get a better view. The water was dark, too dark to see anything beneath the surface. My instincts screamed at me to get in the canoe and leave, but I stayed there, frozen, unable to look away. The sound stopped for a moment, and that was when I heard something else. A faint, barely audible noise, like a soft breath, followed by a low, guttural growl. It was close, too close. I snapped to attention, my gaze scanning the trees, the water, anywhere something might be hiding, but I saw nothing. Then I heard it again, a faint but unmistakable sound. A splash. Someone, or something, was in the water with me. I was no longer alone. I didn't wait. I grabbed my gear, shoved the notebook into my bag, and sprinted back toward the canoe. As I shoved off from the bank, I glanced over my shoulder. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a dark shape move beneath the water's surface. A blur of something large and heavy, just beneath the ripples. My pulse quickened. Whatever it was following me. I paddled as fast as I could, my heart thudding in my chest, but the sound of water moving, of something heavy trailing just below, grew louder with every stroke. I didn't look back, didn't dare, but I could feel it. The thing in the water, whatever it was out there, watching, waiting. And it wasn't alone. I didn't know what Kyle had found out here, but whatever it was had been waiting for him, just like it had been waiting for me. I wasn't sure I wanted to know the truth, but deep down, I knew I was too far gone to turn back. As the swamp swallowed me up again, the oppressive feeling of being hunted settled around me like a thick fog. The creature in the water had made its presence known, but there was something worse lurking just beyond my understanding. I could feel its eyes on me even though I couldn't see it. I was no longer an observer in this place. I was part of it now, and whatever was out there wasn't going to let me leave. I don't remember much of the next few hours. The panic that had gripped me as I paddled away from the water's edge stayed with me, clutching my chest, making every breath feel too shallow. The swamp seemed to stretch on endlessly in every direction, and I had no real sense of how far I'd gone, how much time had passed. The sounds around me, slapping water, distant bird calls, the occasional rustle of leaves, felt distant, like they were happening in another world altogether. Everything felt muffled, as though I were underwater. I finally pulled the canoe up onto the muddy bank, gasping for air like I hadn't breathed in days. I just needed a moment to calm down, to get a hold of myself. I set my paddle down beside me, pulled out my map, and tried to orient myself. I could feel the sweat pooling at the small of my back, my clothes sticking to my skin, the weight of the humid air pressing down on me like a living thing. The map was useless. I had no landmarks, no real sense of where I was. The swamp was a maze, and I had no way to figure out which direction I had come from. It was easy to feel lost in places like this. I knew that, but this was different. It wasn't just that I was lost in the swamp. It felt like the swamp itself had swallowed me, like I wasn't supposed to be here anymore. I shoved the map back into my bag and took a long, shaky breath. I could still hear that faint sloshing sound from the water, echoing in my mind. A memory, but the memory didn't stop. Kept looping, playing itself over and over in my head like a broken record. I looked around the clearing. There was no sign of the thing that had been following me. Nothing but the thick, oppressive green of the swamp, the air so heavy it felt like I might drown in it. But I couldn't shake the feeling, that feeling that there was something just beyond my sight, watching, waiting. I knew I had to get out of here, but I didn't know where to go. I just needed to put some distance between myself and that water. I grabbed my paddle and shoved the canoe back into the water. As I climbed in, my hand brushed against something hard and cold. A piece of gear wedged beneath the canoe's seat. I pulled it out and my stomach lurched. It was Kyle's camera. I stared at it for a long time, my breath catching in my throat. Kyle had used this camera on every trip. He documented everything, from the smallest insect to the oldest trees. It was his thing. He had to have a record of everything. It was strange that it had ended up in my canoe, but not as strange as the fact that it was still working. The lens was intact. The battery appeared to be charged. I clicked the power button, and the camera hummed to life. A few moments of static, then a grainy image appeared on the screen. It was hard to make out at first, just a blur of colors and shapes, but as I focused on it, my blood ran cold. It was a video, a night recording. Kyle's shaky hands appeared on screen, his breath loud in the microphone as he whispered frantically. God, I don't know if this is real, but it's here. You can't see it, but it's here. It's been following me for hours. I thought I heard it moving through the water, but it's not the water. The camera shook, and the image blurred as Kyle seemed to move quickly, turning it toward the trees. I think it's closer. I think it's watching me. The video flickered, and the image jumped, as if Kyle had made a sudden movement. Then there was silence for a moment. He didn't speak again, but I could hear it. The same low, guttural growl I'd heard before. The sound made my stomach flip, like something was crawling up my spine. And then the camera froze. I fumbled with it, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, but nothing more came up. The screen remained stuck on a blurry shot of the trees, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been right there, just out of frame, something I wasn't supposed to see. I shoved the camera into my bag, my hands trembling. I had to keep moving. The sunlight was beginning to dim as I paddled deeper into the swamp. It was becoming harder to navigate, the water thick with algae, the trees pressing in on either side. I could feel the shift in the air, the temperature dropping as the light began to fade. Night was closing in, and the swamp had a way of turning eerie once the sun went down. The sounds of the day faded into an unsettling quiet. The only thing left was the sound of my own breathing and the soft slap of my paddle against the water. I hadn't thought about where I was going. My focus was entirely on putting as much distance between myself and that place as I could. But the more I paddled, the more I realized that I wasn't getting anywhere. The trees were thicker here, the water darker. The path ahead looked just like the one I'd left behind. I was trapped in a loop, and it was starting to sink in that the swamp wasn't going to let me leave. I didn't want to think about it. I didn't want to acknowledge what was happening. I told myself it was just the darkness, the isolation, the quiet playing tricks on me. But every time I glanced at the water, I could feel it again. The thing from earlier, something moving beneath the surface, too large to be ignored. I could almost hear the sloshing again, feel the wetness as it brushed against the side of my canoe. I had to stop. I couldn't keep paddling forever. The weight of the day, the exhaustion in my muscles, caught up to me. The last thing I wanted to do was camp here in the middle of nowhere with that thing still out there in the water, but I had no choice. I found a narrow inlet and pulled my canoe into the thick reeds. It was small enough that I could set up camp without being seen from the water. I tried to gather myself, to steady my mind, but there was a strange feeling gnawing at the back of my skull, a feeling that whatever was hunting me was getting closer. I set up my tent quickly, my hands moving on autopilot. The swamp seemed to grow darker with each passing moment. The trees around me creaked, as if they were watching me, too. By the time I finished setting up, it was almost pitch black, the only light coming from a waning sliver of the moon, fighting through the thick canopy. I lit a small fire by my tent, its crackle the only sound in the oppressive silence. But even the fire didn't seem to chase away the feeling that I was being watched. The night stretched on, and the shadows deepened. I tried to stay alert, listening for anything out of the ordinary, but the sounds of the swamp began to play tricks on me. A rustling sound from the trees, too close. A soft movement in the reeds, just beyond my line of sight. But when I looked, there was nothing there. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around myself, trying to ignore the chill that ran through my bones. I thought about Kyle, about what had happened to him, and the strange camera I'd found. I should have known better than to ignore the signs, to brush off what he'd said. Now I was here, alone in a swamp that had a way of consuming everything, people, animals, even time. I don't know how long I lay awake, staring at the dark ceiling of the tent, my heart pounding. But at some point, I must have drifted off. I woke up to the sound of a soft splash, something moving in the water. I sat up quickly, my heart racing. The fire had died down to embers, casting weak light across the clearing. I couldn't see anything beyond the reach of the firelight, but the sound was unmistakable. Something, or someone, was in the water close enough that I could hear it clearly. I grabbed my flashlight, but before I could shine it, the sound stopped. The swamp had gone completely silent. I held my breath, waiting. Seconds stretched into minutes, but nothing moved. I tried to convince myself that it was just an animal, an alligator maybe, or something else, but deep down I knew it wasn't. And then I heard it again, a splash, louder this time, something moving closer. I swallowed hard. This wasn't just the swamp. It wasn't just the wildlife. There was something else out there, something that knew I was here, something that had been following me all along. I don't know how much time passed. It felt like hours or maybe just minutes. Time was becoming an abstract concept, slipping away like water through my fingers. The silence in the swamp had turned suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. That low, distant sloshing was still there, echoing through the air, though it had quieted, like whatever was out there was moving even more carefully now, almost deliberately, watching. I gripped the flashlight in my hand, my knuckles white, heart pounding against my ribs as I strained my ears for any hint of movement. The tent felt like a flimsy barrier between me and whatever was waiting outside. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know if it was one thing or more than one, but it didn't matter. Something out there was hunting me, and I was a far cry from being able to handle whatever it was. I got up slowly, trying not to make a sound, as if that would somehow keep whatever was out there from hearing me. I turned off the flashlight and tried to peer through the thin fabric of the tent. The fire was nothing but dying embers now, but through the faint glow, I could make out the shapes of the trees, the dark water glistening in the moonlight. No movement, no sounds, but I felt it, the oppressive weight of something lingering just beyond the edges of my vision, like I was the target of something far older than me, something that had been here long before humans came and settled this land. The next splash was louder, too close. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My eyes darted to the dark water, but I saw nothing, not even the faintest ripple. I felt a chill run through me, not from the cold, but from the creeping realization that it wasn't the water that was the danger. It was what was beneath the water. Whatever was following me, whatever had been watching me, was no longer hiding. It was closing in. The sound of something wet dragging against the reeds echoed in the night, followed by the faintest scraping noise, like claws, but not the kind I was familiar with, not like an animal's paws or talons. This was something different, something unnatural. I couldn't wait any longer. I grabbed my bag, slinging it over my shoulder with trembling hands. My mind was racing. My instincts were screaming at me to run. But where? Where could I go? I didn't know the swamp, not like Kyle had. I didn't have a map of the area. All I had was my canoe and the long stretch of murky water ahead, but the sound was so close now, I knew the creature, whatever it was, would be on me before I even made it to the water. I stepped out of the tent, my feet sinking into the damp earth, and I could feel the pulse of the swamp beneath me. Alive, breathing, aware. The stench of rotting vegetation filled my nose, thick and choking. My heart hammered in my chest, and I forced myself to move. The ground was uneven, and every step felt like it was leading me deeper into the unknown. I fought the urge to look over my shoulder. I couldn't afford to turn around. If I did, I knew I'd see it. It, lurking behind me, just a few steps away. And if I saw it, I knew I wouldn't make it out of this swamp alive. Another splash. This one was much closer. I didn't need to see it. I could feel it. It was right there. I sprinted toward the canoe, my breath ragged in the heavy air, every muscle in my body screaming for relief, for safety. The moonlight barely pierced the canopy, casting everything into a suffocating darkness, and I could hear the splash behind me, louder now, as if it was just a few steps away, its claws dragging along the water's surface. The canoe. I had to get to the canoe. I reached the water's edge, but as I shoved the canoe into the water, I froze. It was there. Just beneath the surface, its massive shape shifted in the moonlight, moving slowly, its eyes glowing faintly, reflecting the pale light as it studied me. The water rippled unnaturally, like something large was circling beneath the surface, unseen but present. My heart skipped a beat, and I backed away from the canoe, stumbling in the thick mud. I had heard stories of creatures like this, legends whispered in the dark, about swamp dwellers and water beasts older than the land itself. But I'd never believed them, not until now. Now, standing on the edge of the Blackwater swamp, facing the thing that had stalked me through the trees and the water, I realized that some things in this world, dark, ancient, relentless things, were not bound by the rules of the natural world. They were creatures of the swamp, born from it, shaped by it, and they had no intention of letting me leave. I turned, eyes wide with terror, and began to run. There was no plan, no thought beyond the raw instinct to survive. I could hear it behind me now, something large and powerful moving through the reeds, faster than I could imagine. And I was acutely aware of every soft splash of water, every rustling leaf that told me how close it was getting. I could hear its growls, deep, guttural, like the sound of an animal that wasn't quite an animal at all. It was too far gone for that. My legs burned. My lungs felt like they were on fire, but I pushed forward. The trees blurred past me, their twisted branches reaching out like fingers, and the ground felt like it was shifting beneath me, like the swamp itself was trying to swallow me whole. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I saw it. An opening, a narrow path between the trees that led to a higher piece of ground. It was a small hill, and if I could get to it, maybe I'd have a chance. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I heard the unmistakable sound of something large hitting the water behind me, followed by a terrible, blood-curdling roar. It was a sound that made my body lock in place, a primal, raw sound that only came from something that knew no fear. I pushed myself harder, faster, my feet slipping on the wet earth, but I didn't stop, couldn't. I reached the hill, collapsed on the dry ground, and turned to look back, my eyes searching the darkness, desperate to see if I had gained any distance. Nothing. The swamp was quiet again, too quiet. The growling had stopped, the splashing had ceased. But I didn't feel relief. I felt something much worse, dread. The kind that seeped into your bones and made every shadow a threat, every rustle in the trees a harbinger of something worse. I didn't move. I didn't dare. I sat there, clutching the bag to my chest, my mind racing, replaying every moment of the past few hours. Then came the sound again, but this time it wasn't just the splashing of water. This time it was a voice. Low, distant, a whisper carried on the wind. It was Kyle. It wasn't him, though. Not really, but I recognized it. It was his voice, calling to me from somewhere deep in the swamp, somewhere beyond the trees. I shook my head, trying to block out the sound, trying to convince myself that it wasn't real. But the voice, his voice, grew louder, clearer. It's here. It's watching. You can't escape. I bolted to my feet. I didn't know if it was Kyle's voice or if it was something else. Something that had learned to mimic the sound of the lost, the desperate, the broken. But it didn't matter. I had heard enough. I turned and ran again, this time not caring about where the path would take me. The creature was out there, hunting, and I wasn't going to be its next victim. The swamp swallowed me whole. And when I finally made it out, when I found the road again, I didn't know if what I had just experienced had been real or just some trick of my mind. But I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going back. Not for anything. Because whatever was in Blackwater Swamp, whatever had followed me, had learned how to wait. And I wasn't going to give it a chance to finish what it had started.